Here are the top 5 most common errors of players rated below 1200, and if you get to know this stuff, you can easily punish all those errors and break through 1200 rating yourself. In all the games, all the mistakes that we're analyzing and focusing on the first move, pawn to e4, as that's the most popular on this level and in general in chess. Alright, after e5, white goes for bishop c4, knight c6, and here white could go for, you guessed it, right, the scholar's checkmate with either queen to f3 or queen to h5. Now, of course, the lower you go on the rating ladder, the more frequently you're going to face it. And it is surprisingly popular even below 1200. So actually these moves, queen to f3 or queen to h5, in both cases aiming at queen takes f7 checkmate, are some of the most common moves in this position. So what if your opponent tries some of this stuff, either queen f3 or queen h5? Well, there are different ways to go about this, but one of the most brutal ways to punish that is to play f5 yourself, which it looks like you've just been shocked, you didn't know what to do, and you played a desperate move just to stop queen from coming over here to f7, but instead you just gave up a pawn for no reason. Now, in the vast majority of the cases, your opponents are going to grab it by the queen, aiming for the same queen takes queen to f7 checkmate. Now, if he instead captures by the pawn, which is a lot less frequent option, you'll simply play knight f6, covering this square, also preparing d5, and you just push your opponent's pieces back very effectively with d5, chasing away this bishop. Then you're ready to go knight d4, hitting the queen, hitting the pawn. Maybe then you can push e4. Your bishop is ready to come out from c8 and to grab this pawn on f5, and you just roll out on your opponent very quickly. So that's not a problem. But let's come back to this position. In most cases, your opponents will happily grab your pawn. They think that you're panicking, you don't know what you're doing, you just give it up for no reason. But here comes a punishment. That's the move pawn to d5. Which is an attack of this bishop, as well as a counter-attack of this queen. But your opponents are usually so possessed by the idea of delivering that checkmate, and so far they think that you're playing dumb chess, just giving up pawns because you are panicking and don't know what to do, that in most cases they just grab this pawn, still hoping for queen to f7 checkmate, but here comes bishop takes f5, and that's game over for white. The next common error is a lot of fun. After e4, e5, knight f3, quite a lot of players who are more on a beginner level do not want to engage into heavily theoretical lines after, the Italian game or various kinds of right liver attacks or main lines of the Italian game, which are all very complicated. And for that reason, quite often they just defend the pawn by going pawn to d6, hoping to simply finish their development somehow and just to protect the pawn this way. Now, after that, what you can do is to play bishop c4. Now, your opponents see that you can possibly still create some sort of threats against this pawn in the future, and they often feel uncomfortable, and they go either bishop g4, trying to pin this knight, or pawn h6, trying to take away this g5 square. So let's start by this move, and we'll talk about bishop g5 in a second. So what do you do in this case? Again, your opponents are hoping for an easy life. They think that they're covered, and now they're ready to play knight f6, bishop e7, castle, knight c6, all this standard stuff. So here's what you do. First of all, d4, you hit this pawn. Now it's been attacked twice before they capture it. But now instead of recapturing, you play a surprising move, pawn to c3. In the vast majority of the cases, your opponents are going to capture it, expecting you to recapture with the knight. But here, you drop the f-bomb. Bishop takes f7. And you're calling the king out, so it has to go. But here you follow up with another mind-blowing move, knight to e5. And no, you're not playing give-up chess, you're not trying to give up as much material as you can with every move that you play. In fact, this pawn is pinned, so he cannot take your knight, while it delivers a check to his king. So if he takes it, then you happily grab his queen, you attack the bishop, attack this pawn, the king is exposed, and you win the game. So that's an easy thing. Now, in most cases, your opponents will instinctively just push their king back to e8, thinking that this is a safe square, but the truth is the opposite. After queen h5, that's actually checkmate right here. Queen take f7, and you kind of deliver that scholar's checkmate that just a few minutes ago encouraged you not to try. So in this case, it works. All right, let's take it back as well. What else can black play? Now, their king is under the check. If it goes to e7, then it falls under this fork to their king and rook. Therefore, you're going to grab the rook in the next move and continue attacking his exposed king. And the line which is the most fun is king e6. If your opponent calculated that, those options are bad, he may as well try being that brutal and going forward. But this time you play queen d5 check, the king has to go, and now queen f7 actually is a forced checkmate in a really beautiful manner. The king has to go, and now you just keep delivering checks while developing your pieces and while making a complete fool of your opponent. So not only you just develop your pieces in castle, as classical chess tutorials recommend, somehow along the way you checkmated your opponent's king. Alright, that covers the move pawn to h6. Now you know that you've got a really fascinating way to punish that. How about bishop g4? That's the move that lots and lots of your opponents will play against you, trying to pin your knight down to the queen. Then you play h3, kicking it off. Now, in most cases, it feels like an easy way for black out of this is to take on f3. Plus, lots of your opponents are aware of the legal's checkmate, so-called, which sometimes occurs if bishop drops back. So they take on f3, you recapture. Now you threaten queen takes f7, therefore they cover it, and they think that their position is absolutely good, they're going to develop and have a good life. But you refute that by playing queen b3, and all of a sudden, black is lost. Now, you create a double threat of either grabbing this pawn by the bishop, or grabbing this pawn and also going after the rook. And black is already defenseless. I mean, if they play some casual move, just to show an idea, you can just go ahead and take this, thanks to this battery. The king has to go somewhere, and then you deliver this checkmate. So that's pretty bad for black. Let's give it back. Now, what about black defending this pawn somehow with queen e7 or queen d7? Then you just go after this rook in the corner, and you grab a pawn along the way, and black is once again easily destroyed. Alright, and here comes the number one most common mistake of all. Here you can see the most played moves, and if we just keep going over the top line, most played line by everybody, you can see that we reached the point where we play the two knights game, and here white attacks this pawn on f7, black covers it by going d5, white recaptures, and the most played move up to this day is knight takes d5, which allows white that fried liver attack. Now, what is a fried liver attack? Well, if black plays that actually fails to knight takes f7. And after king recaptures, white follows up with queen to f3, which is check to the king, as well as the attack of this knight. And that usually brings black in troubles fairly quickly, because white continues attacking this exposed king, and that could easily be deadly for black. For instance, if they go king g8, not the best move, but other moves are also typically fairly bad. After that, that's actually already a checkmate within just a couple moves. And here is another interesting thing. If you have a look at the stats right here, you can see that knight takes d5, this error is played by 45% of players. However, if I go to the settings and I take away all the players rated above 1200 and I leave only players rated 1200 and below, you see that the percentage raises from 45 to 66. So basically, the more beginner a player is, the more likely he or she is to play knight takes d5 and fall under this fried liver attack, which is certainly wrong, because just imagine that you tell a non-chess player that you fell victim to a fried liver attack. They might just think you're crazy. What should you do instead of knight takes d5? Well, I'll drop a link below the video in the description with another video where I cover this particular variation and how you should handle it as black effectively. But that's not the end of story. There is actually a continuation to it. Sometimes your opponents mix things up and they kind of play two different openings within one. Now, in this position, we know that there is knight to g5, which leads to this fried liver attack against this pawn. Alternatively, white can choose to play normal development moves, d3, castle, etc. But after d3 and you go knight bishop to c5, guess which move is the most popular on the level below 1200? It's the move knight g5. Kinda white still tries to aim at this attack on f7, but in this position it misses the mark completely, because thanks to the bishop not being there on f8, black is able to simply castle, and he can defend this pawn very naturally without wasting any time, which means that this knight g5 move is just a waste of time. It's simply not helping white at all. But that's not the end of story, because after white castles, usually black just plays h6, d6, and keeps playing standard moves. However, if you know the right way, you can punish white for this mistake and completely demolish them within a couple moves. First off, you strike in the center by going pawn to d5, which attacks the bishop as well as this pawn, and they'll naturally recapture. Now, instead of knight takes d5, you once again hit white with another unexpected and unpleasant surprise, bishop g4. This time you're hitting the queen. Now, strangely enough, there is no convenient way for white to handle this threat. They can't play pawn to f3 because this pawn is pinned down to the king. They could move the knight back from g5 to f3, but they usually don't do it because first of all, they voluntarily pinned themselves, and secondly, just jumping back and forth with the same knight doesn't feel good for white, therefore they usually don't play it, and even if they do play it, it's still bad for white. Now, therefore, they usually just move the queen somewhere. Now, after that, here's another surprise. Instead of taking the pawn, you still just keep pushing, keep attacking. You have superior activity, superior development, and you just want to go all out with your attacks. You go knight to d4, creating a much more powerful threat of knight, grabbing this pawn on c2, and forking the queen and the rook. The threat is simple, but the defense isn't that clear for white. What can they do? I mean, you're going to actually capture this pawn. They can't defend it by the knight from a3 because you can simply eliminate the knight, trade it off, and then you'll still play knight to c2, forking the queen and the rook. Therefore, that's also not a solution. Besides that, besides knight to c2, which is already quite annoying for white, you also have threat of bishop e2 possibly going after this rook on f1 because the e2 square is supported by the knight. So white's position all in all is already really uncomfortable. And quite often they decide that, if there's no convenient defense, let's just grab the pawn at least and go forward, which looks like a decent option for white, but here comes the final surprise. Instead of going after the rook, you go for the bigger fish. You play knight e2, check, king goes to h1, and here's a beautiful bishop to d4. Strangely enough, the queen is trapped in the middle of the board. Your pieces are effectively covering all the squares where it could possibly go to, and you win the game.